Welcome to the next part of these podcasts. I'm John Moffatt from the Heathrop Institute at the London Jesuit Centre. In the last episode, we noted a literary technique common in Greek and Roman literature and used by the Gospel writers for a very specific purpose. The literary technique is to deliberately echo phrasing, language, and incidents from past literary models, in the process of creating something new and contemporary. It is a technique explicitly used by modern writers like James Joyce and T.S. Eliot. The Gospel writers apply this technique to the writings of the Old Testament, the Law and the Prophets, as they tell the story of the life of Jesus. But in their case, it is more than just a bit of cultural artistry. They are doing this to help their readers to Christian insight, so that they can share a Christian way of reading those ancient writings. The Gospels are supposed to help the reader recognize that the patterns of the past are being evidenced in the story of Jesus. Indeed, that those stories contain foreshadowings and direct prophecies of this definitive story of salvation, now fulfilled in Jesus. This process creates the building blocks of theological explanations by establishing recognizable patterns for the way God works. This sort of explanation is intuitively easy to understand in the context of a story. But as we shall eventually see, stories can be multi-layered and ambiguous. And in the history of Christian theology, a lot of time, tears, and ink has been spilt trying to make sense of such theological explanations that do not always sit easily together. When we start to look at John's account of Jesus' beginning and the evolution of the early creeds, we'll begin to see that more analytic dynamic coming into play. For now, though, let's stay with the birth narratives of the Gospel writers Matthew and Luke. Let's recognize that they are both trying to help their readers share the Christian interpretation of the Old Testament as being about Jesus of Nazareth, as the one sent by God to rescue God's people. We can recall that Matthew, like Mark and John, will often spell out for his reader where a text from the past is being fulfilled. When we turn to Luke, however, we see that he prefers to show rather than tell. But what sort of rescuer is this new child to be? What sort of rescue will he bring? In the build-up to the birth of Jesus, Luke's Gospel is even denser than Matthew's in its echoes of Old Testament language. Almost every phrase takes the discerning reader back to themes and incidents from the salvation history of God's people. Luke presents his key characters, Elizabeth, Zechariah, Mary, Joseph, Simeon, and Anna, as the faithful, humble people of God, obedient to the law. They are recognizably the natural heirs to the long history of salvation. These humble people, trying to live out their religious lives, are doing so as subjects of the Roman emperor, who directly or indirectly exercises control of the Jewish territories. They worship in a Jerusalem temple managed by high priests who are complicit in Roman rule. In the background hovers a local puppet ruler, Herod the Great, who, if the Jewish historian Josephus is to be believed, was quite capable of ruthless violence if he felt his authority was being threatened. The political hope of liberation from the Romans was very much in the air in first century Judea. In fact, there was an open revolt after Herod's death against the imposition of one of Herod's sons over the region. The revolt was crushed, and the Romans took direct control of the central Jewish region of Judea, which included Jerusalem and the temple. The Roman regional governor was based in Caesarea, a new Roman port town on the coast, and controlled the nomination of the high priests from the Jerusalem aristocracy. These were allowed to run affairs in Jerusalem, provided that nothing happened to upset the Roman order. At politically charged times of year, like the Passover, when large crowds from the other Jewish territories would be present in Jerusalem, the regional governor would make sure that he was around with a strong military presence. So it is no accident that Mary echoes the revolutionary song of Hannah in Luke's Gospel. or that Zechariah's song looks forward to a people free to worship, freed from the hands of our enemies. It is the humble who shall inherit the land, to serve the Lord in holiness and justice all the days of our life in his presence. In Luke's Gospel, the new heir of David is born in the atmosphere of these hopes. But those aspirations arising in a community of the simple faithful point to a different community, a very different way of life from any earthly kingdom seen so far. We catch a vision of a different sort of society in which the humble, faithful people of God will be able to live in peace and obedience to their God. There then is one hint of the sort of rescue that Jesus will bring. It will both fulfill the people's longing for liberation and at the same time bring something surprising, a new way of forming community. This is subversive. But there is a further deep paradox in this work of rescue. We learn this from the prophecy of Simeon. Seated in the temple, he is given insight by the Spirit and recognizes Jesus as the light of nations and the glory of God's people Israel. Nevertheless, the pathway to this salvation is counterintuitive. Simeon warns Mary, a sword will pierce your heart. This will not be like the triumphant human rescue missions carried out by David and his successors. Any liberation will only come with real pain and loss. The notion of rescue that seemed so clear to start with now becomes much more puzzling. Matthew takes a slightly different tack and directly introduces us to another important theological idea in understanding the different sort of rescue that Jesus brings. His gospel is no less political than Luke's. He makes much of Jesus' authentic royal lineage. Within the story, Jesus' claim to the throne is effectively acknowledged by Herod, the violent usurper king, who takes extreme steps to kill off his rival. His status is reinforced by the reverence offered by the wise visitors from the east. But Matthew adds another element, a new inner existential concern. Joseph is told in his dream, "You shall call him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." Matthew turns our attention away from a straightforward political search for freedom from Roman rule to a collective quest for religious integrity that is both social and personal. He takes us back to the dream of an ideal covenant relationship with God, one which brings true social freedom. We need to recall the founding legends of the people of Israel, the giving of the law, and the turbulent experiences of the newly formed community. The law sets out a way of life, but the first attempts by the new community of God to live authentically repeatedly end in failure. It is no accident that the ritual law is filled with rites that provide a pathway to setting such failures right, through prayer and sacrifices administered by the priests. Sins and social failures happen, but there is a system of religious practices to allow a way back so that people can start afresh. But that idea of saving from sins also takes us back to the experience of the Babylonian disaster and a new strand of prophecy from the time of the exile. According to the theological history in the Book of Kings, the failures in the two Hebrew kingdoms eventually ran too deep. As a result, God had passed a final judgment on the people and their leaders. The community was broken up, first in the north, the kingdom of Israel, and 100 years later in the south, the kingdom of Judah, and the leading people had to go into exile. But in the course of exile, something new happens. We hear it promised in the prophet Jeremiah, and we hear it fulfilled in the writings that go under the name of Isaiah. We hear it also in the prophet Ezekiel, who writes from exile in Mesopotamia in the age of Cyrus. Ezekiel too speaks of a new action by God, who now takes the initiative in restoring the covenant, God's relation with the people. Ezekiel uses ritual language in a new metaphorical way to describe this process of renewal. God will cleanse the people from their sins and give them a new, faithful heart. He will write the law in their hearts. God will inaugurate a new covenant of grace. The disruption to the covenant relationships, social, political, religious, caused by sin and disobedience, will now be healed. They shall be my people, says Ezekiel, and I shall be their God. Matthew's brief explanation of the name of Jesus taps into that memory, but also into a present longing for a healing which is existential and social. Healing from the sort of personal failure that disrupts all the most important relationships in our lives. Such longing is deeply personal, deeply social, and deeply religious. For anyone who had such an awareness of their own incompleteness, their need for healing and wholeness, the life and message of Jesus of Nazareth, the rescuer chosen by God, was here being offered as God's powerful response to those longings. It is important to recognize this when we are trying to understand why Christianity seemed important to many non-Jews. Indeed, why it might still be important today. Other peoples in the ancient world had rituals of purification from the miasma of different sorts of failure, moral and religious. Some of these were very elaborate and had evolved into cults of spiritual rebirth, which required a long process of initiation. These, cloaked in secrecy, were known as mysteries, a word which at its root is probably to do with cleansing from ritual pollution. The language of mysteries was familiar and evocative enough for Paul, and possibly Jesus himself, to use it in his preaching. The popularity of mystery cults across the Greek and Roman world is an indication of that existential longing for some form of inner healing, reconciliation, and renewal. It is a longing to which early Christianity clearly offers a response, in due course even adapting its catechumenal process to mirror liturgical features of the mystery cults. So we can see there is no simple picture of the rescue that this new child, Messiah, and heir of David will bring. As the Gospels continue, they will add to the pointers in the opening narratives. Even so, they will tend to give elusive rather than definitive answers to the reader's questions. They are, after all, offering explanatory narrative, not analytic theology. Readers who want answers to specific questions need to look at the New Testament letter writers, especially Paul. But by interweaving the story of Jesus with the prophetic writings and sacred history of the past, the patterns emerge which allow the reader to see God at work in the life of the man from Nazareth, with models of salvation as healing, liberation, life-giving, pardoning, reconciling, community forming. Beginning with the birth narratives, the reader will build up a profile of Jesus as more than just another rescuer in the historical sequence. There is a critical difference from the stories of salvation past. When Luke says the child will be called Holy Son of God, he is no longer just using a royal title that has been used of David and his successors and was common as a royal title across the ancient world. He is making a distinctively Christian claim that Jesus is Son of God in a way that sets him apart from all the kings and messiahs that have gone before. It points towards the moment in his trial where Jesus self-identifies as the one like a Son of Man from Daniel 7, a figure who rules, rescues and judges at the end of time. Exploring that narrative element will take us beyond the world of theological storytelling into the more complex world of theological analysis that dominates Christian intellectual life for the next 400 years and beyond. But before we look at an early stage in that process in the Gospel of John, we'll spend some time thinking about prophecy in general and prophetic reading in particular. That special way of reading sacred text through those gaps between literal meaning, writer meaning, and reader meaning. This will help us start thinking about something crucial not just to Christianity, but to many other religious traditions: how God communicates with humans. Thank you for listening, and see you next episode.